The issue before us today is often simplified to being a conflict between civil rights and prejudice, liberty versus oppression, old ignorance versus new enlightenment, love versus hate. While I could diminish these arguments by simple rhetorical dismissal, strawman quips, they deserve a fairer consideration. Too often, and for far too long, the issues that force the debate have been carelessly and callously ignored by those in power because they saw little need for thoughtful and logical debate. They didn't see the need in order to win the day. While they weren't always clear about why they had been taught a particular belief, nor why society long held these certain mores, they knew they could easily win the day for those beliefs and mores by simply casting aspersions and by name-calling. This intellectual laziness is, to some degree, responsible for our present circumstance. Competing for that responsibility is the teachers of those foundations, primarily the church. Churches have lapsed into the same lazy practices by practicing castigation and strident condemnation, oftentimes with vigor and hatred that impress their flocks, but failed to demonstrate compassion and love, the love and compassion of our founder, Jesus, that he showed to lost sinners. Certainly their zeal did nothing to win over lost souls that were questioning on the world. It didn't do anything to win over a world that was watching to see if Christians truly separated themselves out as purveyors of love and mercy. For those centuries-long fumblings, I can only express my sorrow and desire for forgiveness, as Christians on earth are not perfect as Christ was, but are struggling to become like him in every way, including able to share the truth, no matter how hard or unpopular, in love. Truth is what must be brought to the fore in this debate, not the postmodern idea of truth, which is each person's truth. This is a faulty ideal of our time and contends that different truth claims can be simultaneously correct and abided with no ultimate conflict. The idea is, you live your truth, I'll live mine. But as simple as that sounds, it is ultimately nonsense and cannot be long sustained. It is the prime foundation of today's thinking and is often labeled as being self-actualization. The problem with self-actualization is other people. My expression of my heart's desires runs smack dab into the expression and exercise of someone else's. The ultimate conflict of such a situation is readily apparent and has demonstrated itself across the world in our modern times and throughout history, whether that conflict be with a dictator demanding acquiescence to his every whim and dictate, selfish or benevolent, in the minor or in the extreme, or to the menial disputing over who has the right of way at an intersection. The denial of absolute truth creates conflicts that lead to confusion, frustration, accidents, tyranny, and death. Ethics and morality have been confused in this postmodern world. Morality, long seen as the sum of a culture's determinations of right and wrong behavior as demonstrated by laws, codes, written and unwritten, is always somewhat flexible. These moral practices may be as simple as the determination of crude and licentious behavior and function to hamper certain behaviors seen to be corruptive to society. Morals were naturally pushed and pulled as people tested their limits. The cut of clothes, the cut of hair, what words are offensive, what pictures are offensive, the style of dance, the displays of affection, treatment of children, the elderly, the poor, the prisoners, the disabled, and the elderly. Ethics are the immutable codes of what is right and wrong. They are the source of morals. Whether articulated directly from God or some other source, they were considered transcendental and unchanging. Do not murder. Do not steal. Honor your father and mother. Do not commit adultery. Do not lie. These commands, not exclusively found in Judeo-Christian heritage and history, have underpinned ethics from prehistory. According to the scriptures, it's because they're exemplar of God's nature and man is made in his image. Therefore, his immutable character is stamped on our hearts. And we see throughout history that societies that live by these values, anchored in a transcendental source, have come closer to obtaining liberty and happiness for their citizens. Government has long served as the institutional enforcer of ethics. In our country, this lawmaking process is subject to the inputs of the people themselves in a grand experiment of self-government. This can lead to confusion that ethics are simply values and truth of half the people plus one. But our nation's founders knew this wasn't true. They specifically contended that the Constitution and style of government were for a moral people, and that the source for morality was the Scriptures and the God of the Scriptures. This is part of why the early shortcomings and failures of our nation and its founders are presently under such unrelenting attack, so as to undermine and make illegitimate all their efforts and beliefs. This deconstruction is a critical factor in what's presently before us. It's readily apparent that the choices a government makes regarding its ethical underpinnings has a dramatic impact on the direction of the nation and its morals. When this nation chose to move beyond reluctantly tolerating slavery, Jefferson, at that time, saying it was as if we had a wolf by the ears, to moving to the promoting of slavery as Calhoun came before the Congress and declared slavery to be a moral good. It forced citizens to recognize the untenable nature of their stated ethics versus the statutorily adopted ones. There was no longer a mushy middle for those who didn't want to confront the obvious dissonance between their stated ethics and the applied ethics of their nation. The obvious truth is that simply declaring something to be right doesn't make it right. Further, in declaring something to be ethical, in stark contrast to the realities of the transcendent values promoted, the overall morals and practices of a nation descend into far more vigorous and sometimes heinous manifestations. Whether one explores the evolution of American slavery, particularly after Calhoun's pronouncement, or Hitler's exponential growth of persecution and the destruction of the Jews, or our nation's present descent into the ever more perverse glorification of the slaughter of the unborn, once the government ceases to hinder acts or views, if their immediate growth thereafter does not stun and cause repudiation, soon the government will condone and even protect those views and actions, even as they delve into what was previously unthinkable and undesired. That brings me to the specifics of this current bill. Why am I and others drawing a hard line on this issue? Certainly our present time would like to argue that these issues are simply bringing enlightenment and freedom where there's been ignorance and oppression. And the advocates are able to demonstrate that affected individuals have been treated with unkindness and hatred. However, it doesn't alter the truth that the law represents a direct support of behaviors that have long been held to be immoral, unethical, and deleterious to society. While many in society today who should be teaching us have lost their connectivity to scriptures and seek to show scriptures saying what is culturally popular, the scriptures are clear that such behaviors and actions are not in the image of God and are not of the natural order of the world. The scriptures tell us that truth is revealed to us in two ways: nature and the Word of God. I will seek to emphasize the former because believers ought to recognize the illogic of expecting non-believers to respect the Word of God. However, for those who know that the scriptures are the Word of God, I beg you take particular note as how you hear nature and scripture are in accord. Male and female are the only two forms of human life. They are the natural order of things and are the very essence of humanity. This structure has been recognized time immemorial. Further, by practice and law, all forms of human government have long recognized the inherent value to individuals, children, parents, families, and society to promote stable families made up of parents and their children. To pretend that other viewpoints were even entertained with any seriousness by science, education, religion, or state until very recently is laughable. One need only check an encyclopedia or dictionary that's more than 5 years old, or look at the nature of laws and the very texts of elementary biology textbooks to know the very definitions of man and woman. Likewise, look to the teachings of secular psychologists like Dr. Spock, who led multiple generations of parents and schools to assert that certain behaviors of a child did not portend their sexuality was anything other than what their chromosomes and phenotypical characteristics denoted. The legislation before us seeks to continue our nation's trajectory toward untying ourselves from these long-established ethics and morals. When many began this effort years and years ago, the pledge was to simply be allowed to live free from moral condemnation and ignominy. For many whose ethics and morals were stridently opposed, although the reasons were poorly thought out or understood, allowing such seemed of very little consequence. It was in a city far away. It wasn't nearby. It wouldn't affect their own workplace, their own church, their own business or home. And the penalties prescribed by laws at that time added to the impetus, especially when there were friends or relatives involved. Nobody wanted to tolerate prison or exclusion for people making a private choice. That hardly seemed American. So these issues marched on to the next barriers, forcing entry into society's art forms and mediums, then pursuing marital privileges, then marriage itself. And now we face the next barrier, forced acceptance into the domains of church, public institutions, and private places of business. There is certain irony that's worthy of note here. Each of these steps were always couched in terms that there was no other agenda to go further, despite the misgivings and predictions of others. However, it's clear here, as it was with the sexual revolution as a whole, it was always about reaching a society where all ethics and morality surrounding sexuality of the human race be reduced to nothing at all. That humans, being nothing but highly involved animals, be permitted to behave with less inhibition than animals, seeking pleasure without bounds or compunction and with utter freedom from any consequence or cost. Indeed, this is appropriately referred to as cultural Marxism, because Marx was explicit in his support of removing the foundations of family and religion. He was also explicit in the power of the state to declare and determine what was right and what was wrong, and that the source of all of man's evils is the oppression upon him. Maslow and others took this perspective by declaring the source of evil is culture itself and its institutions. So despite all the insistence to the contrary, the agenda itself is clearly evident. Tear down all institutions, cultural, mores, ethics that would keep us from maximizing and pursuing our heart's desires. Let us break their chains and throw off their shackles, as the psalmist said. The final piece is the collective demonization of those who stand in opposition to the approved politics of our popular culture. Ultimate political hegemony is the end, not a sharing of power or a convincing by persuasion. Truman wrote, "Society now intuitively associates sexual freedom with political freedom because the notion that, in a very deep sense, we are defined by our sexual desires is something that has penetrated all levels of culture," unquote. This explains why everywhere around us we hear persons and institutions that defended free speech and parental rights now claim that certain speech is too dangerous, too offensive to be permitted, and parental instruction must be superseded. Free speech is no longer seen as a personal expression of disagreement with another one's views, but as a condemnation of that person themselves. Lutzer wrote, "This is how we got from, quote, I disagree with you, unquote, to, quote, I disagree with you and therefore you are evil, unquote." The left says, my ideas can't be discussed independently from whom I am. Therefore, if you disagree with me, it's an attack against my personal identity. If you don't affirm my lifestyle, you're an oppressor who is causing me psychological harm. People and citizens are understandably compelled to consider this issue, not only due to the poor understanding and teachings that I've already referenced, but because of the heritage of civil rights hypocrisy which this nation has struggled with for over 200 years. So it's reasonable that people would be open to hearing that their viewpoints and morals are also wrong today regarding this issue, as they know their predecessors were on race, on handicap rights, on equality for women. However, the nation's failings on equality of race and women's rights are not comparable to the issue before us. There is no natural argument for racial superiority. There is no manifestation in culture to show one race superior to another in the matters of virtue, depravity, talent, art, love, or culture. Likewise, there's no natural argument or manifestation to show women should not be treated with granted equal opportunity. Further, the word itself speaks that such divisions in society are not right or justified. Even in this instance, I'm not arguing that the persons this bill seeks to protect are incapable or unable to be equal contributors to our world. On the contrary, I eschew any and all of those who have attempted to keep them from their rights as human beings or from being treated with compassion. Christ calls on us to treat our neighbor as we would like to be treated, to love our neighbor as ourselves. However, people's accomplishments and rights are not contingent upon their sexual preferences or identity. People need to be judged on the content of their character and the accomplishments of their work. What have been the outworkings of this progression and modifying of long-standing ethics? Has it been the harmless libertarian promise that we've been repeatedly given? It's blindingly obvious that it hasn't been. It has come with tremendous consequence and confusion. Even amongst those who have advocated for some of the changes, they're now blowing the whistle on what's happening now, calling out the storybook hours where drag queens are reading to children, or the drag shows where parents take their little kids to. People in that community are calling that out and saying that should not be happening. That's wrong. Children are being mutilated and maimed for life. Children are invited to be sexual and experience sexualized activities. Parents are told their minor children's sexuality trumps their parental rights. Drugs are being administered to children and adults to cause changes not intended or properly researched when the drugs were approved. Athletics have been impossible to properly regulate or to compete in. Bathrooms no longer provide the sure privacy people rightfully expect. The vulnerable, particularly women and children, have been grievously harmed in numerous venues around the country. Marriage has become nothing special, and families are no longer primarily bound to parentage as the ideal. Language itself has become unmoored from actual meanings of words, and people choose circular reason to define what used to be well-defined. Parents and child advocates are excoriated for speaking out against books, and activists who promote morals and ethics contrary to their own. Property owners and employers are culturally canceled for speaking their views. Contrary to creating a freer society with more free speech and greater equality, the movement responsible for this bill in front of us is hampering freedom and free speech. Not only is free speech hindered by the cultural reactions of simply canceling and doxing those espousing viewpoints out of favor with the prevailing media and culture, but more critically, the demand to utilize language contrary to all definitions and rationality is endangering people's employment. Words themselves are hijacked to have no meaning, while having multiple meanings, as on one hand we are assured there's no difference between the sexes, while on the other hand, individuals are encouraged to identify as one sex or the other, depending on their own personal interpretation of what is the nature and essence of the sexes. In this way, equality is being stolen as women and men find their specific opportunities confounded by members of the sex laying claim to them. It is stolen by pretending that men and women are not different from each other at all in any way, while also insisting that all distinctions are such that one can and must choose to be of a particular identity. Whoa. You might be saying at this point, Senator, if you're so right, why is society moving so fast away from you? Aren't you on the wrong side of history? Didn't one popular president contend that, quote, the long arc of history moves towards justice, unquote? You're an old fossil. Get with the times. Such is the mystery of how mass confusion in popular culture can carry many away from truth and capture them by hollow and deceitful philosophies. But the one little boy who called out that the emperor was naked was right, despite being alone and young. Alexander Solzhenitsyn told the real story how, upon Stalin entering the hall to thunderous applause, it went on and on and on. First 3 minutes, then 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, more than 10 minutes. Thunderous applause. No one would sit down. Finally, one man stopped clapping and sat down, and immediately the rest of the body stopped. The next day, that man was sent to the gulag and told, never be the first one to stop clapping. At this point, many certainly would ask, how can we simply providing employment and housing protections for this minority class cause all these problems? Additionally, hey, enough of the philosophy and the discussion of transcendent truths. I want to know why this is problematic in the practical implementation. Ultimately, my point is about the foundations of thought and understanding that led to this legislation and its alterations to the ethics and morals it creates. While many of those arguments have been made repeatedly here and in other discussions and for multiple years, they certainly bear momentary repeating. This legislation will create impossible to resolve conflicts for churches, individuals, employers, and employees. A church whose janitor, for instance, who's both an attendee as well as is a homosexual. The pastor and the others know about this, but they're okay with it. He understands that his employment means not representing his convictions in contradiction to the teaching of the church. However, upon the passage of this bill, the church would struggle if he decided to suddenly start coming to work dressed as a woman and using the ladies' restroom. Can we stop clapping yet? More dubious is the possibility that employment needs to be terminated for other reasons, but this employee contends the true reason is their sexual choices. Many of you have been in the offices here and understand the necessity of at-will employment. This legislation puts at-will at risk of being unusable. Can we say the emperor has no clothes? Finally, let us consider a situation in a prison, where a female officer is hired, and the officer performs the searches of female prisoners until one day it's revealed that the officer is actually a man. Can the state dismiss this person? Can we say, can the female prisoner sue the state? These are just a sample of very simple hypothetical scenarios where the incompatibility of what's proposed is demonstrated. There are further infringements upon rental owners with strong religious convictions, private schools, foster parents, and adoption. Ultimately, as the decrease in sexual mores has revolutionized our culture and nation, there are costs to bear, and we are paying them in spades. Teenage violence, substance abuse, suicide, and suicide ideation are all persistent and climbing. While advocates claim it's the oppression itself that causes this, that's simply non sequitur when considering that the openness and acceptance of such behaviors has never been higher and now is across media, schools, school officials, churches, teenage peers, and popular culture. I am not blaming such behaviors for these outcomes. I'm blaming the underlying lies about life and its meaning that underpin the movement. Many teens are smart enough to recognize the vanity and pointlessness that necessarily accompanies claims that it's all about you, and if it feels good, just do it. If we are just evolved animals, we'll only live for the meaning we ourselves create. As Dr. William Provine taught, without God, there is no free will, no ultimate meaning, no source for ethics. It leaves a vacuum for the government to fill by edicts that change on the whims of power. And that leaves people looking to themselves for the meaning and ethics, a sure recipe for narcissism and conflict when one person's meaning collides with another. Psychiatrist Keith Abloh says of young people today, quote, "They're doing anything to distract themselves from the fact that they feel empty inside and unworthy. Watch for an epidemic of depression and suicidality, not to mention homicidality, as the real self-loathing and hatred of others that lies beneath all this narcissism rises to the surface," unquote. The choice before us today is not the simple one promoted by the supporters. It's not a simple civil rights matter regarding employment and housing security or a population of citizens that has suffered harsh castigation and discrimination. And the conflict is not as simple as just protecting the free exercise of religion and speech. We are instead looking at making our government advance its approval of an agenda that's contrary to the best interests of society, particularly to the foundations of family, parental rights, and childhood innocence. We do so despite the evidence surrounding us from nature and the scriptures, and even our own common sense. The cost of this legislation to the body politic is to continue to wall off a segment of society as too offensive, too obscene, too dangerous to be granted standing in the public discourse. The dismissal of those who contend such moves as unwise, immoral, or dangerous by the collective demonization of them as bigots, Nazis, or other pejoratives is equally as dangerous to the discussion as was the very essence of fascism. It was unwise for churches and others to fail to understand these issues and explain their positions and rather just shut down and shout down arguments with dismissiveness and name-calling in the past. Now the pendulum has swung to the other extreme, but I don't know that it will swing back this time. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The evidence from history is that those who remain stalwart and uncompromising in their beliefs will suffer the consequences in their rights as citizens and parents, their jobs, tax benefits, their reputations, and likely in other ways. Already we see employment contingent upon agreeing to conform one's speech or to use specific language, even if it becomes nonsensical. We see parents having their concerns dismissed and parents who've lost their rights. Businesses and reputations are ruined by continual demonization. Social media punishes and removes people for saying their opinions. We have already begun the creation of a political underclass purely built on political and religious viewpoint. We aren't in bad company. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego showed us the way a long time ago. When the king set up an image of gold of himself and demanded that everyone bow and worship whenever music played, they refused to do so, despite the positions of power and comfort that they had and risked losing. I will not bow. I will not dance. I will not worship this false idol. God can save me if he wants, but regardless, I will worship him alone. Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like my remarks printed in the journal.